The November rain tapped against the window of the modest ranch house in Eugene, Oregon. Each drop a metronome counting the years that had passed. Inside, a father waited in darkness, clinging to hope that had long since turned to ash. What began as a simple drive home from a soccer tournament became one of the Pacific Northwest's most baffling disappearances. A mother and son vanished without a trace. No bodies. No witnesses. No answers. This is the story of Margaret and Josh Wilson, and the 16 years of torment that followed their inexplicable disappearance on a rainy November evening in 2004. Before we dive deep into this haunting mystery, if you're captivated by cold cases that refuse to fade into obscurity, cases that demand answers and justice, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell. Here at Cold Case Unsealed, we bring you the stories that law enforcement has shelved, the families that refuse to give up, and the mysteries that keep us awake at night. Every subscription helps us shine a light on cases like the Wilsons. Now let's begin. Daniel Wilson sat alone in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the television screen flickering in the corner. His fingers gripped the armrest of the leather recliner, the same chair he'd sat in 16 years ago, when the phone call came that shattered his world into a million irreparable pieces. The fabric beneath his hands had worn thin over the years, threadbare from countless nights just like this one, nights spent waiting for news that never came, for closure that remained perpetually out of reach. On the screen, the local news anchor's face appeared, her expression practiced and somber, the kind of look that television journalists perfect over years of delivering tragic news to strangers. Her lipstick was a shade too bright for the gravity of what she was about to discuss, but Daniel had long stopped noticing such details. He'd seen this segment, or variations of it, more times than he could count. Today marks 16 years since Margaret Wilson and her 10-year-old son Josh vanished during what should have been a routine drive home from a soccer tournament in Bend, the anchor announced, her voice carrying that distinctive cadence of television news, each word carefully enunciated, each pause deliberately placed. Despite extensive searches and investigations spanning more than a decade and a half, no trace of the mother and son has ever been found. Not a single clue. Not a single witness. Not a single piece of evidence that might explain what happened on that rainy November night. The screen cut to a family photograph, one that Daniel knew better than his own reflection. He'd stared at it so many times that he could recreate it perfectly in his mind with his eyes closed. Margaret, radiant in a yellow sundress, her auburn hair catching the afternoon sunlight in a way that made it look like spun copper. Josh beside her, gap-toothed grin wide beneath a mess of dark curls that never wanted to stay combed no matter how much Margaret fussed with them, clutching a worn soccer ball that had been his constant companion that entire summer. Behind them, their silver Honda Accord gleamed in the driveway, freshly washed, the Oregon license plate KJR 489 clearly visible in the photograph. Margaret Wilson was 32 years old, a beloved elementary school teacher at Roosevelt Elementary here in Eugene, the anchor continued. Colleagues described her as dedicated, warm, and endlessly patient with her students. Her son Josh was a fifth grader at the same school where his mother taught. Friends remember him as an energetic, kind-hearted boy with a passion for soccer and a smile that could light up a room. They were last seen leaving the Cascade Youth Soccer Complex in Bend on November 14, 2004, at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. They should have arrived home by 8 that evening. They never made it. The route from Bend to Eugene was straightforward, a drive that Margaret had made dozens of times before. Highway 97 south to Highway 20, then west through the Cascade Mountains before connecting to Interstate 5. Under normal conditions, it was a 3.5-hour drive, maybe 4 if you stopped for gas or a bathroom break or grabbed something to eat. Margaret was a careful driver, cautious, always mindful of the mountain roads that could be treacherous in bad weather. She'd called Daniel from the parking lot of the soccer complex, told him they were heading home, that Josh's team had won their final game, that they'd stop for dinner somewhere along the way. Her voice had been light, happy, full of the kind of mundane joy that comes from watching your child succeed at something they love. That was the last time Daniel heard his wife's voice. Their vehicle, a 2002 silver Honda Accord with Oregon license plate KJR489, has never been recovered, the anchor stated, and Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the physical manifestation of grief that had become as constant as his own heartbeat. If you have any information about this case, please contact the Lane County Sheriff's Office at the number displayed on your screen. The family is offering a $25,000 reward for information leading to answers about what happened to Margaret and Josh Wilson. Daniel's jaw tightened as the anchor continued, but he'd already heard enough. He clicked off the television before the segment ended. The silence that followed felt heavier than the rain outside, pressing down on him with an almost physical weight. 16 years of this ritual. 16 years of paying the local station to run the story, of keeping the case in the public eye, of hoping that someone, somewhere, might remember something, might have seen something that November evening that could crack the case wide open. 16 years of waiting. His phone rang, the sound sharp and jarring in the quiet house. Daniel's heart lurched in his chest the way it always did when the phone rang unexpectedly. After 16 years, you'd think he'd stop hoping, stop jumping every time the phone sounded. But hope is a stubborn thing, a weed that refuses to die no matter how many times you try to pull it out by the roots. He reached for the phone on the side table, his hand trembling slightly. The screen showed an unfamiliar number with a 541 area code. Oregon. Local. His thumb hovered over the answer button for a moment before he pressed it and lifted the phone to his ear. "Hello," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He'd barely spoken to anyone in the past 3 days. "Mr. Wilson?" The voice on the other end was male, young, uncertain. "Yes, this is Daniel Wilson." There was a pause, long enough that Daniel thought the caller might have changed their mind, might hang up like so many others had over the years. Crank calls from people who thought it was funny to torture a grieving man. Tips that led nowhere. Psychics claiming to have visions. He'd learned to brace himself for disappointment. "Mr. Wilson, my name is Tyler Hernandez. I'm a graduate student at the University of Oregon, working on a podcast about unsolved cases in the Pacific Northwest. I was hoping I could talk to you about your wife and son." Daniel closed his eyes. Another journalist. Another person wanting to pick at the scab of his grief, to package his pain into digestible content for strangers to consume with their morning coffee. Over the years, he'd talked to dozens of them. Newspaper reporters, television producers, true crime bloggers, podcast hosts, each one promising to bring new attention to the case, to find answers, to help. Each one ultimately moving on to the next tragedy, the next mystery, leaving Daniel alone with his unanswered questions. "I've heard this pitch before," Daniel said quietly. "You're going to tell me that fresh eyes might see something the police missed. That podcasts have helped solve cold cases. That you're different from all the others." Tyler Hernandez was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more careful. "I understand your skepticism, Mr. Wilson. I really do. But I'm not just another journalist looking for a sensational story. I grew up in Bend. I was 8 years old when your wife and son disappeared. I remember the search parties, the helicopters, the tension in the community. It affected all of us. And I've spent the last 6 months doing deep research into the case. I've found some things that I don't think have been properly explored." Daniel had heard variations of this speech before. They all claimed to have found something new, some overlooked detail that would break the case wide open. None of them ever did. "What things?" he asked, his tone flat, non-committal. "I'd rather discuss it in person, if you're willing to meet. I have documents I'd like to show you. Interviews I've conducted. I'm not asking you to trust me, Mr. Wilson. I'm just asking for an hour of your time." Something in the young man's voice made Daniel hesitate. Maybe it was genuine sincerity. Maybe it was simply that 16 years of dead ends had made him desperate enough to grasp at any straw, no matter how thin. Or maybe it was just that the anniversary always made him vulnerable, raw, willing to believe that this time might be different. "Tomorrow," Daniel said. 2 o'clock. "You know where I live?" "Yes, sir." "I'll be there. And Mr. Wilson, thank you. "Thank you for being willing to talk to me." "Don't thank me yet," Daniel replied. "You haven't given me any reason to." He ended the call and set the phone back on the table. Outside, the rain continued its steady percussion against the windows. The house felt too quiet, too empty, the way it had felt every day since that November evening 16 years ago, when he'd waited for his family to come home, and they never did. Daniel pushed himself up from the recliner, his joints protesting after sitting still for too long. He walked through the darkened house, not bothering to turn on lights. He knew every corner of this place by heart, every creaky floorboard, every scuff on the wall. He'd lived here for 22 years, had brought Margaret home to this house as a newlywed, had brought Josh home from the hospital as a newborn. This house held all of his memories, all of his happiness, and all of his pain. He stopped in the doorway of Josh's room. He hadn't changed anything in 16 years. The bed was still made with the same Star Wars comforter Josh had begged for on his 10th birthday. Soccer trophies lined the shelves. Posters of professional players covered the walls. A backpack hung on the back of the door, still packed with the homework Josh never got to turn in. Daniel came in here sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to remember what his son's laugh sounded like, trying to hold on to memories that seemed to fade a little more with each passing year. Josh would be 26 now. A grown man. Would he have gone to college? Would he have pursued soccer or found some other passion? Would he be married, maybe have kids of his own, making Daniel a grandfather? These were the questions that haunted him, the life unlived, the future stolen. Daniel turned away from the room and walked to his own bedroom at the end of the hall. Margaret's side of the closet still held her clothes. Her jewelry box sat on the dresser, untouched. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand next to a bookmark holding her place in a novel she'd never finished. People had told him he should pack these things away, that holding on to them wasn't healthy, that he needed to move on. But how do you move on when you don't know what you're moving on from? How do you grieve when there's nothing to bury, no closure, no answers? He lay down on the bed, fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep would be difficult tonight. It was always difficult around the anniversary. His mind would replay that evening over and over, searching for some detail he'd missed, some clue he'd overlooked. He'd called the Lane County Sheriff's Office at 9:30 that night when Margaret and Josh were an hour and a half late. The dispatcher had been polite but unconcerned. They'd probably just hit traffic. Maybe stopped for a longer dinner. Maybe had car trouble. Give it a few more hours before filing a missing persons report. By midnight, when they still hadn't arrived and weren't answering their phones, Daniel had been frantic. He'd driven the route himself, searching for any sign of the silver Accord, any indication of an accident or breakdown. He'd found nothing. The sheriff's office had taken his report, put out an alert to nearby police departments, but there was no sense of urgency yet. People ran late. Phones died. There were a dozen innocent explanations. It wasn't until the next morning, when Margaret didn't show up for work and Josh didn't arrive at school, that the authorities began to take the disappearance seriously. By then, nearly 17 hours had passed since Margaret's last phone call. 17 hours during which the trail had gone cold, during which whatever had happened to them had long since been concluded. The investigation had been extensive, at least in the beginning. Search and rescue teams combed the highways and the areas around them. Helicopters scanned the forests and ravines along the route. Volunteers distributed flyers with Margaret and Josh's faces. The FBI got involved because of the possibility of an abduction. Daniel's life was put under a microscope, his finances examined, his relationships scrutinized. Statistics showed that in cases like these, family members were often involved. But Daniel had an airtight alibi. He'd been at work until 6 that evening, then home alone, making phone calls to colleagues and friends that were all documented. He'd had no reason to harm his family. His grief was real and overwhelming. The police interviewed everyone who'd been at the soccer tournament. Coaches, other parents, players. Everyone remembered seeing Margaret and Josh. The team had celebrated their victory with pizza at a restaurant near the complex. Margaret and Josh had been there, happy, normal. They'd left around 4:15, walking to their car in the parking lot. Several people remembered seeing them get into the silver Accord. And then, nothing. They'd vanished as completely as if they'd driven off the edge of the earth. Theories had proliferated in the absence of evidence. Some believed they'd been in an accident, that the car had gone off the road in a remote area and simply hadn't been found. The terrain between Bend and Eugene was rugged in places, full of deep ravines and dense forest where a vehicle could disappear. But search teams had covered the likely routes extensively. If they'd crashed, someone should have found them. Others thought they'd been victims of foul play, perhaps a random attack or an abduction. But there were no witnesses, no evidence of a struggle, no ransom demands. It seemed impossible that someone could abduct a woman and child in broad daylight, or even early evening, without anyone seeing anything. There were darker theories too, whispered at first and then spoken more openly as time passed. Some people suggested that Margaret had run away, that she'd wanted to escape her life and had taken Josh with her. These rumors had devastated Daniel. The people who suggested this didn't know Margaret, didn't understand how devoted she was to her family, how much she loved her life. She had no reason to run, no secret debts or affairs or problems that would drive her away. And even if, by some impossible stretch of the imagination, she'd wanted to leave, she would never have done this to Daniel, never would have let him suffer with not knowing. A few people, mostly internet conspiracy theorists, even suggested that Daniel himself had been involved, that his alibi wasn't as solid as it seemed, that he'd hired someone or had an accomplice. These accusations had cut the deepest. As if losing his family wasn't enough, he had to endure suspicions that he'd somehow orchestrated their disappearance. As the months turned into years with no new leads, media attention waned. The case got colder. Detectives moved on to other investigations. The file remained open but inactive. Daniel had hired private investigators with the money from Margaret's life insurance, but they'd found nothing the police hadn't already discovered. Which was to say, they'd found nothing at all. And so Daniel's life had contracted into this strange half-existence. He'd taken early retirement from his job as an engineer at a local manufacturing company. He couldn't focus, couldn't function in the normal world where people worried about deadlines and quarterly reports. His entire existence had become about keeping the case alive, about preventing his wife and son from being forgotten. He paid for the annual news segments. He maintained a website dedicated to the case. He fielded calls from tipsters and journalists, and well-meaning strangers. It wasn't much of a life, but it was all he had. If you're still watching at this point, if the mystery of what happened to Margaret and Josh Wilson has gripped you the way it's gripped us, do me a favor and comment I am here below this video. Let me know you're invested in finding answers. Let me know that these cases matter to you. And while you're down there, hit that like button. Every like, every comment, every share helps push this case back into the algorithm, back into the public consciousness, where it belongs. Someone out there knows something. Let's find them together. The next afternoon, Daniel was waiting in the living room when Tyler Hernandez knocked on the door at precisely 2 o'clock. Through the window, Daniel could see a young man in his mid-20s, Latino, wearing jeans and a rain jacket, carrying a messenger bag slung over his shoulder. His dark hair was damp from the drizzle that had been falling all day. Daniel opened the door. Tyler Hernandez looked nervous, his eyes uncertain behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was younger than Daniel had expected, boyish almost, and there was something earnest in his expression that made him seem trustworthy. Or maybe Daniel just wanted to believe he was trustworthy. "Mr. Wilson," Tyler said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing me." Daniel shook his hand briefly and stepped aside to let him in. "Come in. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee?" "Coffee would be great, thank you." Daniel led him to the kitchen, poured 2 cups from the pot he'd made earlier, and gestured to the small dining table. They sat across from each other, and Tyler pulled a laptop and a thick folder from his bag. "I want to start by saying that I'm sorry for your loss," Tyler began. "I know that probably sounds empty after 16 years of people saying it, but I mean it. I can't imagine what you've been through. Daniel nodded but said nothing. He'd learned long ago that there was nothing to say to condolences. Thank you seemed inadequate. It's okay was a lie. Silence was easier. I've been working on this podcast for my master's thesis, Tyler continued. It's called Vanished on the Mountain Highways, and it focuses on unsolved disappearances that occurred along Oregon's mountain routes in the early 2000s. Your wife and son's case is the central focus because it's the most mysterious, the most troubling, and frankly, the one that seems most solvable if we ask the right questions. What questions haven't been asked? Daniel said. It wasn't really a question, more of a challenge. Tyler opened the folder and pulled out a map, which he spread on the table between them. It showed the route from Bend to Eugene, marked with highlighters in different colors. The initial investigation focused heavily on the direct route, Tyler explained, tracing the path with his finger. Highway 97 south, then Highway 20 west through the mountains, then down to Eugene. That made sense because it's the fastest route, and the one Margaret typically took. But I started wondering, what if they didn't take that route that day? Why wouldn't they? Daniel asked. Margaret knew that route. She'd driven it dozens of times. Maybe they had a reason to deviate, Tyler suggested. Maybe Josh asked to stop somewhere. Maybe they saw something interesting. Maybe there was construction or an accident that forced the detour. I pulled weather reports from that day. There was a storm system moving through the Cascades that afternoon. Heavy rain, some areas reporting hail. Several accidents were recorded on Highway 20 between 5 and 7 p.m. that evening. What if Margaret decided to take an alternate route to avoid the weather? Daniel frowned. The police would have considered that. They did, to an extent, Tyler said. But they focused their search on the main routes. I've been looking at the smaller roads, the scenic routes that someone might take if they wanted to avoid traffic or bad weather. And I found something interesting. He pulled out several printed documents, police reports and witness statements. I've been interviewing people who lived along alternate routes 16 years ago. Most of them have moved away or don't remember anything useful. But I found one woman, Maria Castellanos, who lived on a rural property off of Highway 31, which runs south of Highway 20 and eventually connects to Highway 97. She's since moved to Portland, but I tracked her down and interviewed her 3 weeks ago. Tyler pulled out his phone and played an audio recording. The voice was older, female, with a slight accent. I remember that weekend because of the storm, the recorded voice said. We lost power for several hours. But I also remember seeing a silver car, might have been a Honda or a Toyota, driving slowly past our property around 6 or 6:30 that evening. I remember because it seemed odd. That road doesn't get much traffic, especially not in bad weather. And the car seemed to be moving cautiously, like maybe the driver wasn't familiar with the area. Did you see who was in the car? Tyler's voice asked on the recording. Not clearly. It was getting dark and the rain was heavy. But I think I saw a woman driving and maybe a child in the passenger seat. I'm not certain about that though. Did you report this to the police at the time? No. I didn't connect it to the missing woman and child until weeks later when I saw a news report, and by then I figured someone else must have reported seeing them. I thought about calling, but I wasn't sure if what I'd seen was even relevant. It could have been anyone. The recording ended. Daniel sat very still, processing what he'd heard. Highway 31, he said slowly. That's a much longer route. Why would Margaret take it? Maybe she didn't plan to, Tyler said. Maybe she got turned around in the bad weather. Maybe she missed a turn. Or maybe, and this is speculation, something happened that made her want to take a less traveled route. Maybe someone was following them. Maybe Josh was feeling carsick and she wanted a slower, less winding road. There are a dozen possible reasons. You said this woman, Maria, lived on Highway 31. Past tense. She sold the property and moved to Portland 11 years ago. But here's where it gets interesting. Tyler pulled out more documents. I accessed property records for that area. Maria's property was fairly isolated, about 15 miles of winding road before you reach another house. But there was one other structure nearby, an old logging access road that branched off Highway 31 about a mile south of Maria's place. According to old forestry maps, there was a small cabin back there, used by hunters and forestry workers. It was on public land, pretty remote. Daniel felt his pulse quicken. Did the police search that area? According to the case files, search teams covered the major roads and some of the forestry areas, but they were working off the assumption that Margaret and Josh had taken one of the main routes. Highway 31 wasn't a priority because there was no evidence they'd gone that way. And this cabin, it was so remote that it might not have even been on their radar. Is the cabin still there? That's what I wanted to talk to you about, Tyler said, leaning forward. I drove out there last week to check it out. The logging road is overgrown now, barely passable, but it's still there. And the cabin is still standing, though it's in rough shape. Mr. Wilson, I think someone should search that area properly. I think there might be evidence there that was overlooked. Daniel's hands were shaking. After 16 years of dead ends, could this actually be something? Or was it just another false hope, another disappointment waiting to happen? Did you see anything when you went there? Daniel asked. I didn't go all the way to the cabin, Tyler admitted. The road was too rough for my car, and honestly, I didn't feel comfortable going alone. I turned back after about a half mile. But I marked the location on GPS. I think we should contact the Lane County Sheriff's Office, give them this information, and push for a search of that area. They'll probably dismiss it, Daniel said bitterly. They've dismissed every tip I brought them for years. Maybe, Tyler said. But I have the witness statement from Maria. I have the maps. I have documentation of the weather conditions that could have forced the detour. That's more than just a hunch. And if you're willing to go on record for my podcast about wanting this area searched, that might generate enough public pressure to make them take it seriously. Daniel looked down at the map, at the highlighted route that branched off into uncertainty. For 16 years, he chased shadows and dead ends. Every fiber of his being was telling him to be cautious, not to get his hopes up, not to let himself believe that this time might be different. But beneath the scar tissue of disappointment was still that stubborn kernel of hope, that desperate need to know what happened to his family. I'll do it, Daniel said quietly. Whatever you need. Interview me. Use my name. Put pressure on the sheriff's office. I don't care anymore about protecting myself from disappointment. I just want answers. Tyler nodded, his expression serious. I'm going to make some calls this afternoon. I have a contact at the sheriff's office, a detective who worked peripherally on your family's case years ago. I'll present this information to him, and see if we can get a formal search organized. In the meantime, I'd like to record an interview with you, if you're up for it. Just your recollections of that day, of Margaret and Josh, of the investigation. It'll be part of the podcast, but more importantly, it might help people remember things they've forgotten, might generate new tips. Daniel agreed, and they spent the next 2 hours recording. Tyler's questions were thoughtful, respectful, never prurient or sensational. He asked about Margaret's personality, her teaching career, her relationships with colleagues and friends. He asked about Josh, about his interests, and his friends and his dreams. He asked Daniel to walk through that last day, every detail he could remember. The conversation Margaret had with other parents at the soccer tournament. The last phone call. The growing panic as the hours ticked by. The investigation that followed. By the time Tyler left, carrying his equipment and his notes, promising to call as soon as he heard back from the sheriff's office, Daniel felt emotionally wrung out. He told this story so many times over the years that it should have felt rote, mechanical, but it never did. Every retelling forced him to relive the worst days of his life. 3 days later, Tyler called with news. The sheriff's office had agreed to send a search team to the area near the old logging cabin. It would take a week or two to organize, to coordinate with the Forestry Service and search and rescue volunteers, but it was happening. Daniel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years, genuine, terrifying hope. The search was scheduled for a crisp Saturday morning in early December. Daniel drove to the staging area, a pull-off on Highway 31 where law enforcement vehicles and volunteer trucks were gathering. The area was more remote than he'd imagined, dense forest pressing in on both sides of the narrow highway. He could see why this location hadn't been a priority in the original investigation. It seemed like such an unlikely place for Margaret to have ended up. Tyler was there, along with his audio equipment, documenting everything. Detective Sarah Kowalski, a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, was coordinating the search. She approached Daniel as he got out of his truck. "Mr. Wilson," she said, shaking his hand firmly. "I worked on your family's case back in 2004, though I was just a patrol officer then. I'm glad we have a reason to be looking again." "Do you think there's really something here?" Daniel asked. He needed someone to give him permission to hope, or permission to prepare for disappointment. Either would be better than this nauseating uncertainty. "I think it's worth looking," Detective Kowalski said carefully. "The witness statement is credible, and the location fits the timeline. But I want to manage your expectations, Mr. Wilson. 16 years is a long time. Even if your family's vehicle is in this area, weather and time have likely compromised any evidence. And there's a real possibility we won't find anything at all." Daniel nodded. He understood. He'd been through enough false leads to know that hope was a dangerous thing. But he was here now, and he couldn't leave without knowing. The search team split into groups. One would search along the highway itself, looking for any sign that a vehicle might have gone off the road. Another would hike the overgrown logging road toward the cabin. A third would use ATVs to cover more remote areas. Daniel wasn't allowed to participate in the actual search, was asked to wait at the staging area, but he couldn't sit still. He paced, drank bitter coffee from a thermos, watched the clouds gather overhead and threaten more rain. Tyler stood nearby, recording ambient sound, occasionally murmuring notes into his microphone. He caught Daniel's eye and offered an encouraging nod, but said nothing. There was nothing to say. They were all just waiting. 3 hours into the search, Daniel's phone rang. Detective Kowalski's name appeared on the screen. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the phone. "Mr. Wilson, we need you to come to our location. We've found something." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Daniel's vision blurred at the edges. He couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "What is it?" he finally managed to ask. "We've found a vehicle," Detective Kowalski said, and her voice was gentle now, careful. "A silver Honda Accord. We need you to help us confirm identification." Daniel didn't remember the hike through the forest. Tyler was beside him, steadying him when he stumbled, guiding him along the overgrown logging road that climbed through dense stands of Douglas fir and cedar. His mind was both racing and completely blank. After 16 years, they'd found the car. His family's car. Which meant they might be about to find out what happened. Which meant the not knowing might finally end. But that also meant learning a truth he'd spent 16 years both desperately seeking and desperately fearing. The logging road opened into a small clearing. The cabin Tyler had mentioned stood at one edge, its roof sagging, windows broken, walls weathered to silver gray. But Daniel barely noticed it. His entire attention was focused on the ravine about 50 yards from the cabin, where yellow police tape cordoned off an area and officers stood in a loose semicircle, looking down. Detective Kowalski met them at the tape line. Her expression was professionally neutral, but Daniel could see the sympathy in her eyes. "It's about 30 feet down," she explained. "The vehicle went off what used to be the road here, though you can barely tell there was a road anymore. It's completely overgrown. The car is heavily damaged and has been exposed to the elements for a long time. We haven't approached it yet. We're waiting for the medical examiner and the crime scene team. But from here, I can confirm it's a 2002 Honda Accord, silver, and the license plate is KJR 489. Daniel felt his knees buckle. Tyler caught him, held him upright. He wanted to run to the edge of the ravine, wanted to see for himself, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. "Are they?" He couldn't finish the question. "Are there bodies in the car?" "We can see remains," Detective Kowalski said quietly. "2 individuals. We won't have positive identification until the medical examiner completes the examination, but based on the size differences, it appears to be an adult and a child. I'm so sorry, Mr. Wilson. The Forrest spun around Daniel. He heard Tyler saying something, heard Detective Kowalski's voice, but the words were meaningless sounds. Margaret and Josh had been here all along. 30 feet down a ravine in a forgotten corner of the forest, while he'd been searching, praying, hoping they were somehow still alive. They'd been here for 16 years, alone in the dark and the rain, and he hadn't been able to find them. He sank to his knees in the wet grass. A sound came out of him, something between a sob and a howl, raw and animal. Tyler crouched beside him, one hand on his shoulder, saying nothing because there was nothing anyone could say. Detective Kowalski gave them space, turning back to coordinate with the other officers. Time became strange and fluid. Daniel was vaguely aware of more vehicles arriving, of people in official vests and uniforms moving purposefully around the scene. Someone brought him water. Someone else draped a blanket over his shoulders. He sat on the ground, staring at nothing, as the people whose job it was to process death went about their work. The medical examiner arrived, a tall woman with kind eyes who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Chin. She spent a long time at the edge of the ravine, examining the scene before carefully making her way down. Daniel watched her disappear into the tangled undergrowth, watched the team follow her down with equipment and body bags, and felt his soul crumble into ash. It was nearly dark when Dr. Chin climbed back up from the ravine. She came directly to Daniel, pulling off her gloves as she approached. "Mr. Wilson," she said, her voice professionally compassionate. "I've completed my initial examination. I can confirm that we've recovered the remains of 2 individuals, one adult female and one juvenile, approximately 10 to 12 years old based on bone development. Based on the location and the vehicle identification, I believe these are your wife and son, though we'll need to confirm through dental records or DNA testing." "What happened to them?" Daniel asked. His voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away. "How did they die?" Dr. Chin knelt so she was at eye level with him. "Based on what I've observed, this appears to have been a tragic accident. The vehicle left the road and went down the ravine. The impact was severe. There's damage consistent with the car rolling multiple times. I believe death was instantaneous for both occupants. They wouldn't have suffered." Daniel closed his eyes. Instantaneous. No prolonged terror. No pain. It was small comfort, but it was something. All these years, he'd imagined every possible horror. He'd pictured them being held somewhere, scared and suffering. He'd imagined them dying slowly, calling for help that never came. At least that hadn't happened. At least they'd been together. "Why didn't anyone find them sooner?" he asked. 16 years. 16 years they were right here. Detective Kowalski answered this time. "The ravine is extremely steep and heavily overgrown. The car came to rest at the bottom, under tree cover. From the road, even from where the car went off, you can't see it. The original search teams came through this general area, but they were searching along the maintained roads, not abandoned logging tracks. And there was no reason to think your family had come this far off the main route. This was, unfortunately, the perfect place to be hidden." Tyler, who'd been silent for a long time, spoke up quietly. "Maria, the witness who saw a silver car that evening, her property is about a mile north of here. If that was them, if they were looking for a place to wait out the storm or got turned around in the dark in the rain, they could have ended up on this logging road by accident. Thought it might loop back to the main highway." "It makes sense," Detective Kowalski agreed. "The weather that evening was severe in this area. Visibility was poor. If they missed a turn, took a wrong road, they could have ended up here without realizing it was a dead end. And the condition of this old logging road, even 16 years ago it would have been rough. In the dark, in the rain, it would have been easy to not see the edge of the ravine." Daniel tried to picture it. Margaret, exhausted from a long day, driving through heavy rain on an unfamiliar road. Maybe Josh was asleep in the passenger seat, lulled by the rhythm of the rain. Maybe she was trying to be careful, to find her way back to the highway. And then, in an instant, the ground disappeared beneath them and they were falling. At least they'd been together. At least Josh hadn't been alone. At least Margaret had been there with him at the end. The recovery process took several more hours. Daniel refused to leave until they brought Margaret and Josh up from the ravine. He needed to see them, or at least the body bags that contained them, needed to know they were finally out of that dark place. When the team finally carried them up, Daniel stood and walked to where they'd placed the bags on gurneys. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched the smaller bag. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I couldn't find you sooner. I never stopped looking. I never gave up. I'm so sorry you were alone down there all this time." Detective Kowalski gently took his arm. "They're going to the medical examiner's office now," she said quietly. "We'll take good care of them. You can arrange for their release once we complete the formal identification and examination. Finally, you'll be able to bring them home." Home. After 16 years of waiting, of hoping, of not knowing, Daniel could finally bring his family home. He could finally have a funeral. Could finally have graves to visit, a place to go when he needed to feel close to them. It wasn't the ending he'd wanted. It wasn't Margaret and Josh walking through the door with some impossible story of survival and amnesia. But it was an ending. It was closure. After all this time, it was something. Tyler drove Daniel home that evening. Either of them spoke much. What was there to say? When they pulled up in front of the house, Tyler finally broke the silence. "I'm going to finish the podcast," he said. "I'll tell the whole story, including today. Including finally finding them. If that's okay with you." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes. Tell the story. Let people know what happened. Maybe it'll help other families, other people with missing loved ones. Maybe it'll remind people to search harder, to not give up, to keep looking even when it seems hopeless." "Mr. Wilson," Tyler said, and there were tears in his eyes now. "I'm sorry this is how it ended. I was hoping, when we started searching, that maybe somehow they'd survived, that there would be some miracle." "I know," Daniel said. "So was I. For 16 years, I was hoping for that miracle. But at least now I know. At least now I can stop wondering. At least now I can say goodbye." He got out of the truck and walked to his front door. Inside, the house was dark and empty, the way it had been for 16 years. But somehow it felt different now. The waiting was over. The long, terrible limbo had ended. Margaret and Josh were gone, truly and finally gone, and he could begin the impossible work of learning to live with that certainty. The funeral was held 2 weeks later, after the medical examiner released the remains and Daniel had made all the necessary arrangements. It was a double service, mother and son together, the way they'd been in life and the way they'd been found. The church was packed with people who remembered Margaret and Josh, people who never stopped caring about the case, people who'd been following the story for years and wanted to pay their respects. Daniel stood at the front of the church and delivered a eulogy he'd written and rewritten a dozen times. He talked about Margaret's warmth, her dedication to her students, her infectious laugh. He talked about Josh's energy, his love of soccer, his kind heart. He talked about the 16 years of searching and hoping and not knowing. And he talked about the bittersweet relief of finally having answers, of finally being able to lay them to rest. Tyler attended the funeral, sitting quietly in the back. His podcast, Vanished on the Mountain Highways, had been released the week before, and it had generated significant attention. News outlets had picked up the story. Social media had spread it. People were talking about the importance of thoroughly searching even remote areas, about not giving up on cold cases, about the families left behind when loved ones disappeared. In the days after the funeral, as Daniel tried to figure out what his life would look like now that the search was over, he received hundreds of messages from strangers. Some were simple condolences. Some were from other families of missing persons, thanking him for never giving up, telling him his persistence had inspired them to keep fighting for their own loved ones. Some were from people who'd been involved in the case 16 years ago, saying how glad they were that Daniel finally had answers. One message stood out. It was from Maria Castellanos, the woman who'd seen a silver car that rainy November evening. She wrote that she'd never forgiven herself for not reporting it at the time, for assuming someone else must have seen something, for not trusting her own instincts. She was grateful that her memory, delayed though it was, had finally helped bring the case to a close. She hoped Daniel could find some measure of peace. Daniel wrote back, thanking her. He told her not to blame herself, that she couldn't have known, that even if she'd reported it immediately, the search teams might not have found the car in that deep ravine. What mattered was that she'd eventually come forward, that her memory had proven to be the key that unlocked the mystery. He told her she'd given him the greatest gift possible, the gift of knowing. Now, 3 months after the funeral, Daniel sits in the same leather recliner where this story began, but something has shifted. The house no longer feels like a mausoleum to the past. He's begun packing away some of Margaret and Josh's things, not to forget them, but to make room for whatever comes next. He visits their graves every week, brings flowers, tells them about his days. He's started volunteering with a nonprofit that supports families of missing persons, using his experience to help others navigate the nightmare he knows so well. The anniversary is approaching again, but this time it will be different. This time, instead of sitting in the dark watching a news segment about an unsolved mystery, Daniel will stand at their graves in the sunlight and remember. This time, he knows where they are. This time, he can honor their memory with certainty instead of desperate hope. Tyler's podcast has sparked changes too. The Lane County Sheriff's Office has committed to reviewing other cold cases with fresh eyes, to searching areas that might have been overlooked, to never assuming a missing person is too lost to be found. Other jurisdictions are following suit. Margaret and Josh's tragedy has become a catalyst for change, ensuring that other families might not have to wait 16 years for answers. Daniel still has hard days. He still wakes up sometimes forgetting for a moment that they're gone, still expects to hear Josh running through the house or smell Margaret's coffee brewing in the kitchen. Grief doesn't disappear just because questions are answered. But at least now he can grieve properly. At least now he's not trapped in that awful purgatory of not knowing, that space where hope and despair coexist in toxic balance. One evening, as Daniel is preparing dinner, his phone rings. It's Tyler. "Mr. Wilson," Tyler says, and his voice carries an excitement that makes Daniel smile despite himself. The podcast just won an award from the International Association of True Crime Podcasters. But more importantly, I've been contacted by 3 other families of missing persons in the Pacific Northwest. They want us to look at their cases, to apply the same kind of thorough research and creative thinking that solved your family's case. I wanted to ask your permission before I agreed. This story, your family's story, it's not mine to capitalize on. Daniel doesn't hesitate. Do it. Help those families. If Margaret and Josh's story can help bring other missing people home, if it can give other families the closure I finally have, then something good will have come from all this pain. That would mean something. That would matter. Thank you, Mr. Wilson. That means everything. And I want you to know, working on this case, getting to know you and your family's story, it's changed my life. I'm going to dedicate my career to this, to helping solve cold cases, to giving families answers. Your perseverance taught me that. After they hang up, Daniel stands at the kitchen window, looking out at the backyard where Josh used to practice soccer, where Margaret used to garden. The November rain has returned, tapping against the glass, but it no longer sounds like a countdown to loss. It sounds like a lullaby, like the world washing itself clean, like the possibility of renewal. He thinks about the 16 years he spent searching, the countless dead ends and false hopes, the nights he wanted to give up but couldn't. He thinks about Tyler, a graduate student who refused to accept that some mysteries were unsolvable, who asked the right questions and looked in the places others had overlooked. He thinks about Maria Castellanos, who held on to a memory for years and finally shared it. He thinks about all the people who helped, who searched, who cared, who never forgot. And he thinks about Margaret and Josh, together at the end as they'd been in life, no longer lost in that dark ravine but at rest in the cemetery on the hill, where the sun shines and the grass is green, and Daniel visits them every week. They're home now. Finally, after all this time, they're home. The mystery of what happened to Margaret and Josh Wilson on that rainy November evening in 2004 had haunted their family, their community, and everyone who followed the case for 16 years. It was a mystery that seemed destined to remain unsolved, another tragic entry in the catalog of people who vanish without explanation. But because one person refused to accept that answer, because a graduate student asked different questions and looked in overlooked places, because a witness finally shared a memory, the mystery was solved. It wasn't the happy ending anyone wanted. Margaret and Josh didn't come home alive. But Daniel got something almost as precious. He got answers. He got to bring them home. He got to say goodbye. After 16 years of terrible uncertainty, he got closure. And that, sometimes, is the best we can hope for. That the missing will be found. That the questions will be answered. That the families left behind will finally know. Rest in peace, Margaret and Josh Wilson. Your story has ended, but your memory lives on, inspiring others to keep searching, to keep hoping, to never give up on the missing. You were loved in life, mourned in absence, and now, finally, you can rest. If this case has moved you, if the story of Daniel Wilson's 16-year search for his family has touched your heart, please take a moment to subscribe to Cold Case Unsealed. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a case. Every story we tell is a life that mattered, a family that deserves answers, a mystery that demands to be solved. Like this video to help it reach more people. Share it with someone who cares about justice and truth. And most importantly, leave a comment. Tell us what you think happened. Tell us which case you want us to cover next. Tell us your own stories of loss and hope and the search for answers. Together, we can keep these cases alive. Together, we can help bring the missing home. This is Cold Case Unsealed, where we refuse to let time bury the truth. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and remember, someone out there always knows something. Let's find them.